Okay, everyone, thank you for joining. I'm Dan Schleifer. I'll be your host today. Welcome to our panel discussion webinar. We want to talk today about FDC3 standards and interoperability and really what's happening in the industry, what the business impact is, and how it's changing the lives of vendors and market participants within capital markets. I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists. Before I do that, a reminder for everybody that just dialed in, recording will come out after the webinar, and if you have questions for the panelists, please submit them via the Q&A panel. I'm your host. I'm Dan Schleifer. I'm the co-founder and CEO here at Mosaic. We were previously known as ChartIQ, for those who may know us as that. We have two products, both ChartIQ, our pre- and post-trade analytics package for charting, and we have Ensemble, which is a desktop interoperability platform that is an implementation of the FDC3 standards for people that want to pull those applications together. I'm joined today by Matt Harvey. Matt is joining us from the UK, where it is sunny today. Matt is at NatWest Markets and is the head of cross-product sales and development. I apologize, the full word development didn't fit on the slide, and is responsible for all of the technology that the different teams use across front office cross-asset class. We're also joined by Mike Beattie from Charles River Development. Mike has been with Charles River for a long time and is responsible for product strategy there today, and really representing the buy-side order management system and investment management system in the world of interoperability. And finally, we're joined by Brad Mumme, who is SVP of Product Management at FactSet. FactSet is a longtime friend of Mosaic. And Brad as well. Brad recently joined them about a year ago to head product management, but has been in the industry for a long time at a number of different firms, and will have great experience and expertise to share with us. Just very quickly what our agenda is today before I jump into the questions for the panel. We just covered introductions, so we're right on time. We're going to jump into a panel format discussion, really focused around, again, FDC3 and desktop interoperability. We're going to talk a little bit about the theme of the current state of FDC3, how it's going in adoption, the evolution of the standards, and then we'll segue directly into really the impact on the market and on business as a result of that. So what are the actual industry business trends that we see as a result of these evolving kind of technology standards? So kind of zooming out from the tech side of things and into how it's changing the behavior of market participants, of vendors, how it's changing the relationship between vendors and each other as they work in a world of openness and interoperability to better serve their clients. And then finally, we'll segue into a few questions around kind of the future of interoperability and what changes we expect to see in the market as a result of these evolving standards. Finally, we will do audience Q&A. As I mentioned earlier, there is the Q&A panel right there in WebEx. If you have questions that come up at any point during the panel, feel free to go ahead and submit those, and we'll address all of the audience questions towards the end of today's session. With that, I'm going to go ahead and go out of screen sharing mode, which after a year of the pandemic, I finally know how to do. And I'm going to kick it off. So guys, if you want to unmute yourselves, first off, thank you guys for attending.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, so we all know each other, but you guys might be new to the audience. I gave basic introductions, but when I give you your first question, feel free to give a brief introduction of yourself and kind of your perspective in the market. I am going to kick off actually with Matt from NatWest Markets. Matt, you guys, full disclosure, you're a client of ours, but you guys have been thinking about interoperability in FDC3 for a long time for a firm. FDC3 is currently focused on very simple workflows, things like passing context messages, launching applications. The real world inside a firm like NatWest is obviously far more complicated than those kind of simple workflows. So as the FDC3 standards evolve, how do you think the standards need to grow and support the more complex workflows that actually affect your users? And where do you think of the drop off between what the standards can do today versus what your users inside the bank really need?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so big question to start. Thanks. Thanks for having me again. You got my job description exactly right. So yeah, I'll skip over that bit. Well done, gold star. So yeah, I guess for NatWest Markets, as you know, we've been speaking to you for a few years about this. There's a few ways that we're positioning FDC3. So in conjunction with a desktop management pattern, which you're very close to, the opportunity really for us was to try and create some kind of joined up single user experience across a whole host of what I guess will be very familiar to a lot of large organizations, kind of legacy applications, new build applications, and vendor applications. I think it's fair to say we're not short of applications in number. We're not short of data, but we definitely we're missing that kind of capability to present a joined up desktop with the right information at the right point in time in a particular salesperson or trader's workflow. I think you could argue that maybe you could achieve that using some proprietary patterns, and I've worked at some other institutions where we definitely went for that approach. I think for us, the thing that caught our attention around FDC3 was the extent to which you then just retain optionality. So we build functionality and we have a functionality line around the organization that must be useful to our clients, for example. An order management or order status monitoring blotter, some of our market data tiles. It stands to reason that they're as useful to our own salespeople or our own traders as they potentially could be to clients. So we thought, right, why don't we just center around this, maximize our use of non-proprietary technology? And we've obviously used firms like you in the desktop management space, Dan, coupled with FDC3, we're just minimizing that kind of proprietary build. I think in terms of moving forward, I think it's really powerful having like Brad and Michael on the call. I think more vendors and more fintechs that like center around this pattern, the more optionality we all have. So I think for me, adoption needs to continue at the pace it is. It needs to be embraced by people that want to be part of both an internal desktop and a desktop that we and other liquidity providers can present out to our clients, and hopefully become a lot more dynamic. Like the dream state for me is whether it's a vendor that we've partnered with or an internal application that we're building out, it just lands on the desktop dynamically, discovery of intents just works. We click on an application one morning on a Monday and all of a sudden there's a new option to launch a new piece of MI or a new piece of functionality in context. I think that's the nirvana, and if we evolve anywhere near towards that end state, I think, yeah, we would all be very happy.
Got it. Well, thanks for that. Brad, Mike, anything to add there?
No, look, I'm headed toward that same nirvana. I think we'll probably get into sort of how that applies, and we test it and we roll out and we put some governance around it. But I think we're generally on the same page there. Yeah. Got
it. So Brad, maybe I'll turn to you for a moment, and Matt mentioned kind of that nirvana state of being able to kind of, I hate to use the word plug and play because plug and play computer technology was never quite what it promised, but that plug and play utopia around being able to mix and match in-house applications and vendor applications. Obviously, you guys are a huge vendor on the street. How is FDC3 driving a different set of conversations with your clients around integration and workflow and kind of participating in that, that plug and play reality?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a natural extension or evolution of integration in those discussions we've had with customers for years. There's traditional kind of back-end integration, server-side integration, data integration, the proliferation of APIs and data feeds and so forth. I think that, what's been a little bit left behind is the kind of the workflow at the front end on the desktop, and to be able to join disparate applications when it's always seemed like a bit of a mystery on how to do that. And it has been, right? Because everybody has their own different protocols and different ways of interoperation and things like that. So I think it's just an extension of traditional, kind of content or, integration, if you will, that, now that you can look at it more holistically, even from the desktop, to give the user the opportunity to, take advantage of all the services and products and capabilities on their desktop, and to be able to extract value from them, more efficiently. And it's again, for us, it's a great way to be able to expose the capabilities that we have, right? Instead of leaving it up to the user to kind of hunt and peck around. You could almost look at it as a way to kind of create an opportunity of a catalog of what's there, what's in front of the user, and help them understand how to stitch those workflows together with this type of interoperability. So, it just hopefully adds value to the service that we provide by giving the chance to extract value from it through interoperability.
So I think it would be fair to say that some vendors might look at this as a bit of a threat, Brad, right? Where, Matt's ability to kind of mix and match applications might actually be a threat to stickiness on the desktop. It sounds like you take the other side of that argument and see it as an opportunity. Maybe you could just expand on that for just a moment.
We always have to be cognizant that the customer is the customer, and they're going to choose what the best of breed or the best solutions or the best technology or the best software. You can either kind of push back against that, or you can embrace that and say, fine, then we're confident that we have strong capabilities, strong assets, strong content, and so forth. So, like I said before, if you can make those capabilities and that content more easily available, then we would expect that the end user would recognize the benefit of the service that they're paying for with FactSet, right? Make it easier for them to use more of it. If there's something better out there, then we need to do a better job to compete against it. But otherwise, the customer's going to figure this out on their own. So we might as well join the ride.
I tend to agree, but obviously I'm biased. Mike is one of the other vendors on the call. You want to chime in on that?
Yeah, so first of all, by the way, you got my background correct as well. So you're 3 for 3 there, Dan, in introducing us. Yeah, just to rip a little bit off of that piece that Brad said, we look at the future as a platform, right? And so when you think about how this market is going to evolve, it's not just a silo where you're doing everything. Like Brad said, I think there's best of breed in certain places. And when you think about, Brad's points and Matt's, and they come together a little bit, that nirvana is thinking through UX design, workflows, event-driven, sort of persona-based workflows in a platform. And the interop piece of that is a big part of that. And so, we don't look at it as a competitive threat either. There are certain things you're going to do well and certain things where you're going to partner. And partnerships are a big part of, I think, how this industry is going to grow, both on the buy side and the sell side.
It's an interesting topic, and obviously I have a little bit of insider knowledge when I ask you the question, but I would ask you, when you talk about those workflows for clients, has this era of interoperability and openness actually deepened some of your own client relationships in being able to sit down and talk with them and help map out those multi-vendor workflows, as opposed to kind of, I don't want to say that you guys were ever siloed, but is it driving a better, richer conversation with clients about how you can really add value into the workflow?
Yeah, great question. It absolutely is. And, there's a few things happening, right? Over the last year, all of us are in these offices in our homes, but we have more access, believe it or not, to our clients and to the individuals that we work with. And you're having deeper conversations with them about your workflow and what you do. And I think that opens things up quite a bit. And I would rather have a conversation about, well, take me through your price discovery process and what you do during the day and what works and what doesn't, and think about a trader persona or a portfolio manager persona than the pieces of the technology that are getting in your way. And, for that reason, I think it's made some of these conversations a lot more efficient.
I know I'm the moderator, but I'm gonna weigh in with 2 cents on this one just myself, because it's been interesting as a desktop interop vendor. We're working with a lot of the vendors in the industry that want to deliver their applications through our platform to their clients and have it snap into their smart desktop. It's been interesting talking with product teams and UX teams, where most product teams think of their application as the center of their client's universe. And the reality is very few applications are actually the center of the universe. Crims might have an argument to be made that it's the center of the universe, but a lot aren't. But the UX paradigm around building a single page web application with a left-hand nav and all of the stuff, and you picture your client as you map out their user journeys all within your application, and that broadening of the horizon of saying, actually, your client's user journey starts before your application, goes into your application, and then goes over to the next application, I think is challenging in some ways and threatening to some, but it's a super exciting set of conversations we have with clients. So, sorry, go ahead. Somebody was about to jump in.
Nope.
Okay, sorry. So, Matt, you touched on something briefly a couple moments ago that I wanted to zoom into, which is, you guys, we think of you as a market participant. We think of you, as a client. But the reality is that as a sell-side firm, you're also a vendor in this space, right? It's not just FactSet and Charles River; they're vendors on the call. You're a vendor to your buy-side counterparts, and you touched on this a little bit as far as some of your internal components that you've built that you think would add value and basically pushing out to your clients as part of that kind of single dealer platform experience. How, if at all, has this kind of interoperability changed the way that you think about pushing that stuff out and the way that you can service your clients effectively as a vendor integrated into their workflow?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting evolution. So I speak to clients a lot about using our platforms and the other platforms that they've got available on the desktop. I think anyone that thinks the kind of the position going forward that you can defend is just landing your big container on the desktop that does everything for them and have like prime real estate, or and have the client bringing up your whole platform to use what might be a very small piece of highly valued functionality. I think it's just not the end state. I've been at clients and they're like, yeah, great, really interested in this service. How do I access it? And it's kind of, yeah, you just launch this big thing, install this thing on your desktop, and adopt our proprietary standard if you want it to talk to your tech. Like, that was not my current organization, by the way, but that conversation doesn't play out very well. The initial interest kind of wanes quite quickly. So I think for us, I mean, our Agile Markets platform is already, it doesn't have an install prerequisite, so that's already good. But even in that context, I think it's very reasonable for a client to say, well, I don't want to take the whole thing. If I really value your gamma hedger, or a particular piece of functionality within the overall container. I think things like FDC3 just maximize our chance of kind of breaking that apart a little bit and putting the right functionality in their desktop in a way that makes sense to them and fits with their workflow. So there's kind of that around our existing platform, but yeah, it's so obvious from some of our internal builds that we've got going on that a lot of the functionality that we deliver to our sales and trading, it must be required on our client's desktop. And I've got plenty of examples from recent conversations with clients where there's definitely this isn't a one size fits all. I'm not trying to say like this is the only way we want to engage with our clients. Integrating with some of the providers we've got on the call, providing APIs. We just want to be as frictionless as possible. Like that's our aim. We want to make our joint workflow better, be as frictionless as possible, so that they can use the functionality in the way that makes sense to them. If that's us dropping a UI component on the desktop with some highly valued functionality so that they don't have to duplicate that functionality and build it again, great, we want to do that. FDC3 is part of the solution there so that it can be an integrated part of their desktop. Equally, if they're using an OMS provider, we'd like to integrate with that, and the client can use our functionality and our wares through that, or direct APIs. But I think going forward, without this kind of option, without this kind of pattern, I just wonder how long you can really kind of preserve this current state of very large containers being landed on the desktop from liquidity providers as everyone's moving into a multi-liquidity provider workflow, essentially.
Yeah, I think you touched on a couple of topics that I want to dive into. One is kind of, we're talking about application to application interoperability, but I think person to person and firm to firm is something that we want to touch on. But before we get into that, you started to talk about kind of how long could the world kind of go forward in the old paradigm, and I think it's we were having a chat, the four of us, but before the webinar a week or two ago, and the topic of the parallel to fix came up, and kind of other standards that have evolved in the industry, and how we kind of almost can't imagine a world, we can't imagine a world before them, to be honest, right? Like the idea of trying to connect to as many liquidity providers as people do and trading venues without fix is unimaginable. I guess I'll toss this out, Mike, first to you. Each of the three of you have a lot of experience in fix, more than me, but Mike, I'll start with you. Any thoughts on kind of the parallel there and the evolution of fix and how that might create a pattern or a precedent for how FDC3 evolves?
Yeah, so in that prep call, I think we learned that each of us are nerds about fix, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay to admit that to the audience here. But yeah, so two things. One is looking at the way that fix evolved is interesting, but comparing the technology in general, right? You think about FDC3, there's the interaction here with an open standards API, a bilateral agreement. You're sending data inbound and outbound. You're thinking about a technology independent to a certain extent type solution where you can customize on one side and you don't have to really, on the vendor technology side of the other, really update things. And you dig even further at the standardized API. There's intent, there's verbs, there's context. A lot of that follows the same suit of what's happening in fix, right? You look at fix, it follows those same thoughts. One is you've got different versions. You've got 4.0, 4.4, 5.0. There's different message types. It's part of that, right? You've got like new order singles, execution messages, and then tags within that. And it's funny when you start to think about fix. In looking at it for so long, people tend to be negative in some cases and say, "Oh, it's customized," and there are 30 versions of the new order single. But I take the other side of that, right? I think it is so used. And it really was successful for what I think is, a few different reasons. And the more interesting part of this conversation, I think, is actually what made it successful. And I think it's really 3 or 4 different things. And first, I would be sitting here in Boston, I would be remiss to say the rumor about fix is that it was created in 1992 by a Boston-based asset manager and a sell-side firm, and it sort of pivoted along from there. And what I think made it really successful is it is a truly vendor-neutral protocol, and it was community-driven. I want to come back to that community piece because I do see FDC3 parallels there as well, right? But it was backed by the buy side and the sell side. And one of the things I've learned over the last sort of 20 years in this industry is if that equation does not balance, and this is buy side only or it's sell side only, it's not going to be successful. And I see those same parallels here with FDC3. It's beneficial to buy side folks in the same way that fix is, and they can interact with the larger street and do that quickly. It's also beneficial to the sell side and the way that they interact with some of their clients. But I'll come back to the community piece. But the last thing that I think made this successful actually is the regulatory push on the fix side, and I see some parallels there. And I know we're going to hit on that, but before I get into the regulatory piece, I actually think the real magic on the fix side actually happened in some of those smaller communities. And you've got the fix protocol and the working groups that are part of that. And for those of us that were part of those things along the way, there's a parallel with some of the regulations. When I think about regulations, I have my big 3 that I always talk about, which is Reg ATS in the US, Reg NMS, and MiFID II. In each one of those, the debates and the conversations about tag 30, tag 76, what values would come in last market or MPIDs, things like that, I actually think drove the protocol forward. And that combination of thinking about using the technology and then the regulation itself driving things forward, I think that really made it successful. And I see a lot of parallels here. Obviously, the regulatory environment globally is changing and there's different opportunities. But I think that's what really jump-started fix. And some of those arguments and conversations in those smaller groups were interesting along the way, for sure.
Well, and a quick shout out to the FDC3 working group, which actually had their meeting starting an hour and a half ago.
Yep.
And those guys are hard at work. We've got a couple of guys there very actively involved, as I think some of your firms do as well. So we get to sit around and talk about the business impact. They're there doing the hard work. Brad or Matt, any thoughts on kind of the parallels with Fix?
Yeah, I kind of would, well, I totally agree. I think there's a ton of parallels. Fix is, was revolutionary in the way to, kind of from a transactional order flow standpoint and, connecting, counterparties. Obviously, it's been a huge, kind of driver technologically and driving business. But I almost kind of see it, I would parallel that Fix comment and discussion with the way in which I think people have gone about building desktops historically. I'm going to kind of leapfrog a little bit here into the desktop from a Fix conversation and say, I think people have historically built desktops based off of a container strategy in order to bolt things together so that they can speak a common language and facilitate workflow. And anything outside of that container has been kind of freestanding, and therefore there's no common language, there's no communication between, right? So the beauty of something like FDC3 in parallel with Fix in my mind is it doesn't need to be a fixed deployment, a container-based type desktop deployment in order to achieve a handshake from a workflow perspective with disparate applications, right? So there's the parallel to Fix in my mind is it's traditionally the way things were done were through proprietary message protocols and Fix evolved and it was at least a foundation. I know there's custom tags all over the place and there's always going to be. And I just see like FDC3 as a way to, potentially give people an opportunity to look outside of the traditional desktop container strategy in order to bolt things together in a harmonized fashion. Something like FDC3 would allow for things that are not harmonized strictly within a container to speak elegantly with one another.
I agree, and I would actually point out, I think one of the spots for improvement in FDC3 is that FDC3 is focused around app-to-app communication, but we are starting to see situations where there's container to container integration, because you do have, you went from proprietary third-party applications or containers to, frankly, frameworks like our own Ensemble or OpenFin or Glue42, and bridging between those, given that clients will now have applications living inside different FDC3 desktop agents, as they're known, and so that desktop agent to desktop agent piece really needs to be ironed out, I think, as an evolution of the standard. But that's my 2 cents. Matt, any thoughts just to circle back to Fix and starting to feather in the impact of regulation?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of it has been covered. I think in summary, I think so regulation, like in general, it drives more transparency, more sharing of data, more logging of data at many levels. And I think if you look at the workflow that's happening around the execution process for both us and our clients, there is no getting away from the fact that there are multiple applications that take you through from the initial point of client contact through price requests, through pricing, through execution, risk management. So in the course of doing that, MiFID, for example, has placed many more requirements on the information that's captured at those key stages. And so the concept of FDC3 and some kind of conformity to common standards is just an obvious kind of backdrop to that. Otherwise, you would be there is no getting away from knitting these applications together somehow and capturing common data, whether it's basic timestamps or information on the counterparty you're speaking to, or the contact, or the instrument definition. Like, none of us want to reinvent that 10 different times. And when you think about putting any shared tech, making any of that kind of shared tech available to clients, our clients have got the other side of that workflow. They've got a lot of the same record keeping requirements around timestamps and what have you. So being able to say, look, we've adopted a non-proprietary standard here, for our own internal workflow, in the same way that Fix kind of got driven by, okay, we need to describe instruments in a common way, we need to describe axes in a common way. That's exactly what's happening here. And yeah, I think it's completely analogous. Yeah.
Got it. Mike, do you want anything to wrap up there? I've got a follow-up question that actually came from the audience, but any follow-up thoughts on the regulatory driver?
No, I think we hit on it.
Got it. So I said we would leave audience Q&A to the end, but this one's relevant to the FIX conversation. So Ian asks, FIX is clearly a major part of financial markets. I've heard it said that the evolution and usage of FDC3 as a standard is still in its relative infancy. Would the panel say that is still the case? How prevalent is it across the marketplace?
I don't mind jumping in quickly. I mean, I think
Please.
for us, there's pieces of this that are still in its infancy. I think when you start to think about some of the bilateral interaction, I think for some of the very standard flows of sending out, some intent and context, when you think about visualization and charts and pieces of that's been there for a little bit, right? And I think those are working well. Where I think it is going to go from a maturity standpoint is more bidirectional interaction. And what I mean by that is passing intent back and forth for an RFQ or something where I'm showing you a piece of security and then getting information back in quotes and driving that further. And some of that is starting today, obviously, but that's where I think some of the next steps are. And FIX has been around for quite a while, and so I don't think it's quite at that level yet, but there's a reason why we've been talking about it here for a while in this webinar. We think that's where it's headed. I don't know, Matt or Brad, what you think, or as far as infancy versus maturity.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think, from infancy state, to some extent, I think it's only going to be driven, excuse me, by the community, right? So like you said before, it's buy side, sell side, it's vendors, it's the network effect. If you're going to find something that is practical, if it's easy enough to work with, if it creates enough of an advantage and you get more and more people using it, it's just like the hockey stick. At some point, if you get critical mass behind something like this, then it'll take off, and then the functionality will come with it. Everybody will swarm around the necessary functionality that it needs if you get enough buyers of it, to start to use it. So, the more from a community standpoint, the more that there's, conversation going on between the market participants, whether they're on the business side or whether on the vendor side, if we're working together to solve these challenges and we find that there's, an interesting set of solutions, then, it's all about critical mass and then it'll fly.
I do think as well, Dan, there's definitely parallels to the FIX journey here. I mean, it's obviously a relative infant. FIX has been around a while. I think we can all remember like the use of custom tags in FIX, and and over time, what happens is things get more type driven, more defined, more structured, and it feeds into the whole process. So I don't think it's a bad thing. I would rather be in this stage of having something that broadly works. We're using it in production, as many people are, and there's a level of customization that's driving from real use cases into the working group extensions of the standard, than locking ourselves away in a room for 5 years and trying to come up with a theoretical standard that covered everything. I think this is by far the better option. So any kind of payoff between it being incomplete or maybe not as structured as it could, I think, it definitely pays back in being able to use it as an early adopter and drive it from real use case, real requirements.
I think, I'll weigh in briefly. Obviously, I have a bit of sample bias because we're a vendor in the space. So most of the conversations that we have with vendors and market participants involves FDC3 standards. So it comes up all the time for us. But I would just say that, probably in the past 6 to 9 months, we've seen a real rapid acceleration of not just kind of the people preaching to the choir and kind of the little FDC3 echo chamber, but that it's really taken off more broadly, and that the snowball is rolling downhill and gathering steam. And it does, to Brad's point, require, right, the vendors are only going to do what our customers ask of us. And then when the customers start asking, the vendors start doing, more customers see value out of it, and it starts to snowball. And I think we really see that rapid acceleration right now. I think one of the questions that comes up is, how much should FDC3 do? So when I'm asked about the relative maturity of FDC3, I always say, well, it's defining a very basic set of nouns and verbs and app directory and APIs. It needs to evolve, and you need to be able to extend the standard. And again, I think that parallel back to Fix is similar, where everybody has extended it, perhaps too much, too far. But there's always a balancing act of a standard being useful in real world workflows versus being too prescriptive or vendor specific. We got a question from the audience, actually, Rico, who's on the working group. I think he might actually be the chair of the working group. Says people often mention needing more standardized data types supported. How can FDC3 engage participants to extend its footprint to support RFQs, different asset classes, et cetera, and is a bridge to Fix necessary? So it's an interesting question about how far the standard goes and how it extends and where it might overlap or dovetail with things that are actually happening in Fix. I don't know if one of you guys wants to tackle that.
I'll jump in, and if you guys want to correct me or take the other side of it, have at it. So yeah, look, I think there's a visual process is part of some of this, and some of it is less deterministic, more of, hey, there's some sort of decision I have to make in it. When I look at price discovery, this is the perfect example, is you think about it across different asset classes, specifically within fixed income. And the other thing, by the way, I think all of us figured out is we like to get a little bit more detailed in the fixed income side and talking about some of these things. When you look at that disparate marketplace and all the data that's out there, the beginning part of that process, I think, is a visual one, in that I want to see all the axes or the runs and a real good view of that marketplace, number one. And then number two, the back and forth, I think, can happen through, to a certain extent, a visual process. There is still room for Fix across the transaction piece of this, the post-trade piece of this. I don't think that this is a mutually exclusive conversation that we're having here, right? And just the bigger picture as we think about integration, at least from a Charles River standpoint, is I look at it in three tiers. That visual process I talked about, almost a middle type tier where it's a services interaction, where you've got Fix interaction, or you've got a RESTful interface or a JSON message, and then you've got your back end piece of it, which is database and a data heavy interaction. You're always going to have some combination of those three things. And I think the visual side of this can interact, right? And I do think there's a piece of this over and above RFQs that could drive adoption of FDC3, other regulations, and we can come back to that later. But that's my 2 cents and just that general question, Matt or Brad. I don't know what you guys think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Axes is a good example, isn't it? Fix is sitting there with Fix IOI. If there are crossover concepts with, like you say, that vast amount of data being delivered to disseminate Axes using that standard, it would kind of be remiss not to, if there were crossover concepts, not to make the modeling consistent with FDC3 standards. And I mean, I don't see too many departures, like graphic departures. I'm not in the technical details, much some of the other people on the call, but for my eye, I can't see FDC3 going in a different direction around anything that I spot as a crossover. So yeah, I mean, I'm all not for reinventing the wheel and having some consistency around what are probably a very relatively small set of common data constructs that need to be passed around. Counterparty.
You could even see the addition or the coupling, the handshake with APIs in general with respect to FDC3. Surfacing relevant market data information in a contextual FDC3 handshake coupled with a market data component that's coming from a data API, even whether it's at the desktop or server side or otherwise. But they seem to start to blend pretty quick in the amount of workflow or functionality that you would expect out of beyond just straight context passing between two applications.
I'll tell you what I think can, just one more point, Dan, if that's all right, on this. Sure. What I think can drive some of the adoption of FDC3 and expand it is new regulations or a change in regulations. And when you start to think about beyond just the market structure trading piece of it, something like ESG regulations that are happening both in Europe as well as in the US, environmental, social, governance regulations, and the amount of data that's out there, you're always going to need to persist data, and there's a piece to that. But I actually think some of those workflows would be a great complement to what's going on with FDC3 and thinking about, over and above just an E and S and a G score, but, carbon information, emissions, all kinds of stuff there. It's a great opportunity. I mean, we hear a lot about that from our clients. I think it's a great opportunity for this space to think about visualizations around ESG and how we can make that easier and tie in all the vendor space there.
Yep. I think I'm going to wrap on that topic briefly. I would just say, Mike, your comment about the different layers of the integration stack, and I think Brad touched on this earlier in the discussion, are really important. That FDC3 makes a ton of sense for user interaction and that kind of integration, and things like Fix for kind of system to system and kind of network level. And so I think to think about the old OSI model in networking or something, and you kind of start to see where a workflow might start at one level and then need to dip down to the Fix level and then go back to the user experience level. And as we start, again, I think the theme we talked about earlier, having these really great conversations as clients, as vendors, about the end-to-end workflows of our users and mapping that across the different integration layers that make the most sense for that part of the journey. I want to shift just a little bit. I think we've talked kind of about the what FDC3 is and isn't, kind of some of the industry adoption and the historical trends. And on the adoption side, I would just point out, right, we've got the head of product management for FactSet, the head of product for Charles River, major vendors in the space adopting this stuff, which I think is a really positive sign. Once we've kind of reached this utopia of every application talking to every other application, so to speak, there's concern about an interop free-for-all. So how do you guys think about security? Things like authentication, authorization, and protection of messages layering on top of FDC3. So Mike, I'll toss this one to you first. I would imagine in CRD's case, not everything should be able to communicate freely with, or heaven forbid, snoop on the the CRIMS application. How do you think about that? And if we solve for part one, how do we get things to talk? Then how do we start solving for part two, and how do we control what can talk?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, if it's FactSet data or NatWest data, we're going to wave them right in. No, at all.
Green light.
So no, look, on a serious note about some of this, and we talked about this in some of the earlier meetings. Just because a technology can support integration with anyone at any time doesn't mean that's the right way to follow suit on this. And so I talked about the concept of a platform, and that's important to us. But there's pieces of a workflow and certification and knowing your counterparties that's important here. And when you're talking about financial transactions, when you're talking about interacting with a process, well, there has to be certification around that. I mean, you talk about, and I know we're beating the Fix piece of it to death here, but when you talk about Fix certification, everyone does that. It's a known thing. Well, the certification has to happen in this construct as well, especially if you're transacting on something. And so part of it for us and how we think about the protocol is, number one, I want to know the counterparty, and I want them to know our data and to have a handshake there and a decision ahead of this integration. Even though the integration is going to be lightweight and easy, there's a certification process that surrounds that. And so the testing piece of this, the workflow, understanding the data you're passing back and forth and agreeing on that and having that construct, I think is an important part of this. And so you'll see ecosystems or platforms grow quickly, but we have to be careful in the way that we structure some of this and that we test it and we monitor it. And I think there's a balance there. And for us, on the Charles River side, that's an important part of how we're going to use this protocol moving forward is understanding that workflow and making sure that a client understands it and we understand their certification process to a certain extent.
I think maybe a couple of things that so I think internally we've played with a couple of different approaches here, and I think the one we've landed on is there is so much functionality and data available to the desktop that most of the time, if you had all of your applications over, 99% of the time they would tell you nothing, because they're not event driven. you know, what we're talking about here really is moving towards an event-driven like business process. Event-driven architectures aren't new to technologists, but they're definitely new to a lot of people in around, you know, trading businesses. So, you know, I think the it's just advertising the fact that you can go somewhere and there's an available piece of functionality or data available to you, even if it takes you to an endpoint, hopefully a graceful kind of endpoint that tells you you can't access it, or you know, it's not available. I think that's where FDC3 really helps, because just managing kind of the intent piece to show you that, you know, you've clicked on a blotter, you've clicked on an instrument, there's some available actions to you that you can then go off and do something, is valuable in its own right. You know, discovering onward applications and nuggets of data that can help your workflow at the right point in workflow, even if you don't have access, is still high value, because, you know, that's a one-off problem that you solve at that point and it works next time, kind of thing. So I know that's not quite the kind of security that you were talking about, Dan, but, you know, in terms of everything having to be open so it can all interoperate and seamlessly exchange data without any thought for permissions, like that's kind of the landing ground that, you know, we've landed on here, which is surface the action, advertise it, and at that point you've shown, you know, there's some valuable stuff you can go off and do. And I think the other thing is, you know, we're talking about largely a client-side interaction pattern. By definition, a lot of this is going on the person's desktop, and you know, I think that once again that provides a little bit of comfort. You know, there's desktop agents running here that yeah, have at its, you know, can see everything that's going on the desktop. And I think when you look at some kind of, when you look at other applications or use of other APIs, then clearly, you know, it's a bit harder to gather all of the required information and logging around what's happening and what data is being exchanged where. So, you know, to me, it sounds like, you know, potentially an easier problem to crack, but like, I'm not a technologist.
Brad, any thoughts on that from you before we move on to
No,
the final
yeah,
question?
not much
Data
more. I mean,
have to be a big thing for you, I would imagine.
well, it's, you know, and I think that's, you know, in the infancy stage of FTC that we're talking about, you know, single security context, and we're, you know, basic handshakes between applications is one thing. When you get into personally identifiable, you know, kind of information, portfolio level information, transferring that information from app to app, if it's, you know, that secondary, that application that you're publishing that to is, you know, effectively going to be, you know, have visibility into that level of data, then there needs to be, you know, concern around security, obviously.
Yeah, and I'll just speak to the vendor side. We have clients starting to do exactly that. And so those security conversations and the approach there, I think, is at the forefront. I think last question, if there are any audience Q&A, feel free to submit those. You know, just looking out at the future, we've kind of talked about the parallels. We've talked about FDC3 and where it stands right now. You know, how do you guys see the adoption changing over the next, call it 12, 18 months? We've been looking back and reflecting on FIX. How do you think we'll look back and reflect on FDC3 a couple of years from now? Brad, I'll start with you since you're on screen.
Yeah, I mean, we're, you know, we chose to get in front of it, right? And we, you know, and that's what you have to do. And you have to be out there a little bit in front of things. You know, we hear positive feedback, clients talk about it. We're talking more and more about it. You know, we don't want to be on our heels and, you know, everybody runs right by us. So, you know, our strategy is to be as open as we possibly can and to work with, you know, kind of tools like FDC3. You know, it's client driven. The more that they're, you know, interested and having conversations, we, you know, we take a consultative approach with our clients. We work on blueprinting solutions with our clients, whether it's our solution or many solutions combined, how we can fit into that discussion and in those blueprinting, you know, exercises. So, you know, we're you know, welcome arms with our customers to continue to push the envelope and the utilization around this. I think, you know, in a selfish kind of way, I see it benefit both from a customer and our standpoint at FactSet. I think it's a great opportunity for, you know, it's not just a technology play. It's not just a business play. It's not a market data IT conversation play. You know, I think it's a collective of all areas within our customer. I think it's an opportunity to help our customers understand how to extract more value from FactSet, being able to surface that information and give it to the end users more easily. You know, you could literally create, you know, catalogs of what information from FactSet is available as it pertains to a workflow, and let users hit those things much more easy without, you know, figuring it all out, right? So you could help users get value out of what they're paying for. So again, not to be a huge sales pitch, but I think, you know, that's a big play for us, is just helping our customers use our service more effectively.
Mike, what about you? What do you see as kind of the next 12, 18 months? How do you think we'll reflect on FDC3 in the future?
Yeah, you know, I think this brings us full circle to the beginning of the conversation. I think 12 to 18 months out, we have the option here to be talking through a workflow, an end-to-end workflow, outside a platform, within a platform. And, you know, we hit a lot of these buzzwords throughout the day, and Matt hit it, I think, most recently in the event-driven piece. That's something we talk a lot about: event-driven, persona-based interaction, this visual process. What do you care about during the day? We create personas for traders, for portfolio managers, and to not have to think about the technical friction, so to speak. I think we hit on that one too. That I think is a great part of these conversations, and you can have a much more efficient conversation about these things. And, you know, my hopes and my dreams on the utopia piece 12 to 18 months out are that we're truly having a workflow conversation. Here are the axes that I want to see. Here's the TCA data that I care about. Here's the visualization of a heat map of the market that I want to see. And then full circle, you know, we paint that picture for them within the platform and talk through that piece of it.
Awesome. Matt, you get the final word. What's the future going to look like, my friend?
Oh, wow, I got the first one as well. Excellent. So yeah, I guess I would hope that we would reflect on, yeah, a year. I can't remember the time frame you said. Is it a year or 18 months of adoption? I think one of the most powerful things that's happened within NatWest Markets recently is a colleague, head of rate sales, in two instances, one with an internal application and one with a vendor application that was talking about, you know, potential space on the desktop. He turned around and said, what are you doing to make sure that you're going to be part of our new integrated sales desktop? You know, have you guys heard of FDC3? It's incredible. Like, when do you ever hear, you know, head of rate sales say that within an investment bank? It's incredibly powerful. You know, this particular vendor said, oh yeah, you know, we're looking at it. And I think as agents of change across the financial services desktop collectively, we've all got a responsibility to center around a standard. Like, this is the standard that's in front of us right now. It kind of works, you know, quite well in a number of ways. It's got a lot further to go. I think we've all got to kind of pause and, you know, do that challenge. So for me, it's easy. Internal applications, vendors, fintechs that, you know, come into the organization. It's one of the first conversations I have, you know, what standards are you using to open up your application so that it can be part of, truly part of our integrated desktop and our workflow. And it's the same, you know, throughout the front office now, particularly sales that have, you know, got the kind of start of a very integrated workflow driven desktop. So yeah, I mean, I'd hope that we'd be thinking, you know, great, you know, it's been a real adoption year. Adoption's just spiked to unbelievable proportions, and everyone's, you know, centered around the standard.
Well, gentlemen, I can't thank you enough. We've gone a little over time. Hopefully everybody found it interesting. So thank you guys for participating. I want to just encourage everybody, if you have more questions about the history of FDC3, what it is, how it works, etc., we have a whole guide online and downloadable at Cosaic.io/FDC3, where you can learn a bit more. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me personally. If you asked a question and we didn't get to it, we'll make sure to route it to the right person. Matt, Brad, Mike, thank you, gentlemen, so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. A recording will be sent out shortly, and I appreciate your time.